Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The setting sun bathed the sprawling Umaran estate in Lagos with a golden glow, its rays bouncing off the sleek black gates and the tall, glossy windows of the mansion. Inside, the house was a picture of opulence, a modern African masterpiece. Artworks from across the continent adorned the walls, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and eucalyptus from the essential oils Manda had imported from South Africa. Yet despite the grandeur, an eerie silence loomed. Manda Umaran sat in the dining room, staring at the untouched plate of jollof rice and grilled fish before her. Across the table, her husband Dan swirled the wine in his glass absent-mindedly. The clinking of the glass against the table was the only sound in the cavernous room. "Dan," Manda finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but firm, masking the storm of emotions threatening to burst forth. "You haven't eaten anything. Is something wrong?" Dan glanced up, his face a mask of exhaustion. "I'm just tired," he replied, forcing a smile. Manda wasn't fooled. After nearly 15 years of marriage, she knew him too well. "It's not work, is it?" she pressed, her eyes narrowing. Dan sighed heavily and set the glass down. "No, it's not." She didn't need him to elaborate. They both knew what was eating away at him, the same thing that had haunted their marriage for over a decade, the absence of a child. Manda's shoulders slumped, her carefully curated poise cracking. "Dan, we've tried everything. The doctors have said there's nothing physically wrong with either of us. Maybe we're just meant to wait?" "Wait." Dan's voice rose, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We've been waiting for 10 years, Manda. How much longer do you think we should wait?" Manda looked away, blinking back tears. She hated this helplessness, this endless cycle of hope and despair. They had done everything, consulted fertility specialists, prayed, fasted, and even considered adoption. Nothing had worked. "Do you think I don't cry every night, wondering if I'll ever hold my own child?" she said, her voice cracking. "Don't make it seem like this is just your burden." Dan's face softened as he reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean it that way." But the damage was done. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with unspoken fears and regrets. The streets of Abuja bustled with life as vendors called out to passers-by, hawking everything from roasted corn to leather sandals. Dan adjusted his tie as he stepped out of his sleek SUV, taking in the vibrant chaos. He was here for a business trip, overseeing the construction of a luxury high-rise. The hotel he was staying in was just as grand as the project he was managing, with marble floors and a chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 stars. As he approached the reception desk to confirm his reservation, his eyes caught sight of a young woman cleaning the glass doors. She moved with practiced efficiency, her brown skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. Something about her simplicity and quiet beauty drew his attention. "Good evening," he greeted her as he passed. The woman looked up, startled. "Good evening, sir," she replied softly, clutching the cleaning cloth in her hand. Dan paused. "What's your name?" "Tash," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded and moved on, but throughout the evening his thoughts kept returning to her. There was something about her, something refreshing, untainted by the complexities of his world. The next day, he found himself looking for her again. He asked the hotel staff and eventually spotted her sitting outside during her break, her knees drawn to her chest. She looked lost in thought, her face shadowed by a somber expression. Acting on impulse, Dan approached her. "Tash, are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She stood up quickly, startled. "I'm fine, sir," she said, though her eyes betrayed her words. "You don't look fine," Dan pressed. "What's troubling you?" Tash hesitated, her hands fidgeting. "It's nothing, sir. Just..." Dan wasn't convinced. There was a vulnerability about her that tugged at his heart. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," he said, surprising even himself with the offer. That evening, he found her in the hotel lounge, sitting alone with a cup of tea. This time, their conversation flowed easily. Tash opened up about her struggles, how she had been orphaned at a young age, how she worked tirelessly to support her younger siblings, and how lonely she often felt. For the first time in years, Dan felt seen. He shared his frustrations with his marriage, his longing for a child, and the weight of expectations that seemed to crush him daily. Their shared vulnerability created an unexpected bond, and soon their conversations became a nightly ritual. One evening, as they sat together in Dan's room, Tash spoke about her fears and dreams. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and Dan reached out to comfort her. In that moment, the boundaries blurred. What began as an innocent gesture turned into something more, a lapse in judgment that would alter their lives forever. Dan left Abuja days later, consumed by guilt. He resolved to forget what had happened, to bury it as a mistake born of weakness. But weeks later, a call from Tash shattered his resolve. "Dan, I need to see you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's important." When they met, Tash handed him a small envelope. Inside was a note from a doctor confirming her pregnancy. Dan stared at the paper, his world tilting on its axis. "Tash, are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't plan for this, but now I don't know what to do." Dan was torn. He knew he couldn't ask her to terminate the pregnancy. It would be hypocritical, considering how much he longed for a child. But how could he bring this news to Manda? How could he ask her to accept the child of another woman? Back in Lagos, Dan finally confessed. Manda's reaction was as explosive as he had feared. She screamed, threw things, and demanded to know how he could betray her. But beneath the anger was a deep sorrow, a sense of loss that cut deeper than words. "I didn't plan for this," Dan pleaded. "It was a mistake. But the child, this could be our chance." "Our chance?" Manda spat. "You want me to raise another woman's child as my own? Do you know how humiliating that is?" Days of silence followed. Manda retreated to her room, crying herself to sleep every night. But slowly, her anger gave way to contemplation. As much as she hated the situation, the thought of finally having a child softened her resolve. "Fine," she said one evening, her voice cold. "I'll accept the child. But that woman must stay far away from us. I don't ever want to see her or hear about her again." Dan nodded, relief washing over him. He met with Tash and explained the arrangement. Tash, her heart breaking, agreed. "If it's for the baby's sake," she said, "then I'll do it." Months later, Tash gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. She named her Anike but knew she would never call her by that name again. With tears streaming down her face, she handed the baby to Dan. "Take care of her," she whispered. "Make sure she knows she's loved." Dan promised. But as he walked away, holding the child in his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would haunt them all. The cries of the newborn filled the delivery room as the doctor handed the swaddled baby to Tash. She was pale and exhausted, her body trembling from the exertion of labor. Yet, when her eyes met her daughter's for the first time, an overwhelming wave of love and heartbreak swept over her. "She's beautiful," Tash whispered, her voice hoarse. She gently traced the baby's tiny fingers, memorizing every detail of her face. In that fleeting moment, she felt a bond so profound it was as though time itself had stopped. But the joy was bittersweet. The knowledge that this was the last time she would hold her daughter weighed heavily on her. As Dan stood in the corner of the room, his face a mixture of awe and guilt, Tash knew what had to happen next. "Take care of her," she said softly, handing the baby to Dan. "Make sure she knows she's loved." Dan hesitated before taking the child. His hands trembled as he cradled the infant, who squirmed and let out a soft whimper. "I will," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make sure she has the best life possible." Tash nodded, her tears flowing freely as she watched them leave the room. The door closed behind them, and with it, a chapter of her life she would never fully recover from. Back in Lagos, the baby was introduced to the Umaran household. Dan and Manda decided to name her Annie, a modern, westernized version of the Yoruba name Anike that Tash had whispered to Dan before their parting. The name change was symbolic, a way for Manda to erase the reminder of her husband's infidelity and assert her place as Annie's mother. Manda threw herself into motherhood with fervor. She decorated the nursery in pastel pinks and whites, filling it with every imaginable luxury. A custom-made crib imported from Italy, shelves lined with toys, and a mobile that played soft lullabies. To the world, she was the picture of a devoted mother, and for a time, even she believed it. Annie became the center of her universe. She was showered with love, affection, and gifts. Manda meticulously documented every milestone, from Annie's first steps to her first words. She attended every school function, ensuring everyone knew Annie was the cherished daughter of the powerful Umaran family. Dan, too, played the role of doting father, though the guilt of his actions never completely left him. He overcompensated by being overly attentive, often canceling meetings to spend time with Annie or bringing her lavish gifts from his business trips. But as Annie grew, the cracks in their perfect facade began to show. Annie was a bright, curious child, quick to learn and eager to please. But her privileged upbringing began shaping her personality in troubling ways. From a young age, she was taught that she was special, better than others because of her family's wealth and status. Manda, though well-meaning, reinforced this belief by indulging Annie's every whim. By the time Annie was in primary school, she had developed a sense of entitlement that set her apart from her peers. She refused to share her toys, looked down on the household staff, and demanded perfection in everything. Her nanny once quit after Annie threw a tantrum so severe that she smashed a vase because her breakfast wasn't served in her favorite plate. Annie is just confident, Manda said dismissively when Dan expressed concern. She knows what she wants. There's nothing wrong with that. Dan disagreed but kept his thoughts to himself. He had learned over the years that challenging Manda on parenting matters only led to arguments. Instead, he focused on giving Annie the guidance he felt she needed, spending hours teaching her about their family's history, values, and the importance of humility, lessons that often seemed to fall on deaf ears. As Annie entered her teenage years, her sense of superiority became more pronounced. She was the queen bee of her exclusive private school, commanding attention and admiration from her classmates. She wore the latest designer clothes, carried the newest gadgets, and hosted extravagant birthday parties that were the talk of Lagos's elite social circles. But beneath the glamour, Annie's relationships were shallow. Her friends admired her wealth more than her character, and she often dismissed anyone who didn't meet her standards. Her teachers described her as intelligent but arrogant, a natural leader with little empathy for others. At home, Annie's behavior began to strain her relationship with Dan. He often found himself at odds with her over her treatment of the staff. "Annie, you can't talk to people like that," he said one evening after she berated the gardener for accidentally trimming a rose bush she liked. "Why not?" she replied flippantly. "He works for us. Isn't that his job?" Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yes, but that doesn't mean you can treat him like he's beneath you. Everyone deserves respect." "Whatever," Annie muttered, rolling her eyes before storming off. Manda, overhearing the exchange, defended Annie. "She's just young, Dan. She'll learn in time." But Dan wasn't so sure. He worried about the kind of person Annie was becoming, but his hands felt tied. The guilt of his secret and the desire to maintain peace in the household kept him from pushing further. Meanwhile, Tash, now living under the radar in Enugu, followed Annie's life from a distance. Through social media and news reports about the Umaran family, she watched her daughter grow, her heart aching with every milestone she wasn't there to witness. She saved every picture she could find, creating a small, hidden scrapbook of Annie's life. Tash's life was far from easy. Though Dan sent her financial support regularly, she worked multiple jobs to maintain her independence and support her siblings. She tried to fill the void in her heart by focusing on her family, but the longing to see Annie never left her. She dreamed of the day they might meet, even if it was only from a distance. The years passed, and Annie blossomed into a confident young woman. She excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university abroad. Manda and Dan were proud, though Dan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. As Annie prepared to leave for university, Dan took her aside. "Annie," he said, his tone serious. There's something I want you to remember as you step into the world. Your worth isn't defined by your wealth or status. It's about the kind of person you are, the way you treat others. Annie nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't fully grasp his words. I know, Dad, she said lightly. Don't worry about me. Dan smiled faintly, hoping that somewhere deep inside, she would carry those words with her. Little did he know, his time to guide her was running out. Months after Annie left for university, tragedy struck. Dan suffered a massive heart attack and passed away, leaving a void that shook the family to its core. Manda, devastated by the loss of her husband, struggled to keep the family business afloat. Annie returned home, her grief mingled with the weight of new responsibilities. It was during this time that a stranger appeared at the gates of the Umaran mansion, a woman who would change everything. The loss of Dan Umaran cast a long shadow over the household. The once lively mansion now seemed eerily quiet, its grandeur dulled by the weight of grief. Manda, despite her sorrow, wore a mask of resilience. She threw herself into managing the sprawling family business, determined to honor Dan's legacy. Annie, now in her early 20s and fresh from university, returned to Lagos to take her place as heiress to the Umaran Empire. Annie's arrival brought a spark of life back into the house. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control, her every step echoing the entitlement she had carried since childhood. However, her return also brought tension. Without Dan's steadying influence, the relationship between Annie and Manda became strained. Manda's grief left her less patient with Annie's demanding nature, and their arguments became frequent. Enter Jena. Amid this tension, Manda realized she could no longer handle the household's responsibilities alone. She decided to hire additional staff to ease her burden. One of the positions she sought to fill was that of a cook. After interviewing several candidates, she met a woman named Jena, a quiet, middle-aged woman with an air of dignity. Jena had a natural warmth about her, and her culinary skills were undeniable. She prepared a test meal, egusi soup with pounded yam, that left Manda impressed. Jena explained that she had years of experience working as a cook and was eager to settle into a stable role. What Manda didn't know was that Jena was none other than Tash, Annie's biological mother. After Dan's death, Tash had seen an opportunity. Her heart ached to be close to the daughter she had given up so many years ago. She knew she couldn't reveal her identity, but she hoped that working in the household would allow her to quietly watch over Annie. You seem capable, Manda said, her tone professional but kind. When can you start? Immediately, ma'am, Jena replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Annie meets Jena. From the moment Annie met Jena, the tension was palpable. Annie barely acknowledged her presence, dismissing her as just another servant. Her first words to Jena were curt and cold. Make sure my coffee is ready by 7 a.m. sharp, Annie said without looking up from her phone. I hate waiting. Jena nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Yes, ma'am. Though hurt by Annie's dismissive tone, Jena reminded herself of her purpose. She wasn't here for validation, she was here for her daughter. Over the following weeks, Jena became indispensable in the household. Her meals were a hit, her attention to detail impeccable. The other staff admired her quiet strength and hardworking nature. Even Manda found herself relying on Jena more than she had anticipated. But Annie remained unimpressed. She often found fault in Jena's work, nitpicking over minor details. This jollof rice is too spicy, she complained one evening, pushing her plate aside. Do you even know how to cook properly? Jena simply nodded, swallowing her pride. I'll make sure it's better next time, ma'am. Familiar face. While Jena endured Annie's disdain, another member of the household began to take notice of her. Okay, the family driver had been with the Umarans for years. He was a keen observer and knew the family's history better than most. Something about Jena seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place her at first. One afternoon, as he drove Jena to the market, he decided to probe. You remind me of someone, OK said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Jena stiffened but kept her tone casual. Do I? I doubt we've met before. OK narrowed his eyes. Years ago, I used to drive Mr. Dan to Enugu for business. There was a woman he used to visit there. You look a lot like her. Jena's hands trembled in her lap, but she forced a smile. I think you must be mistaken. Okay didn't press further, but the wheels in his mind began turning. He started piecing together the timeline and couldn't shake the feeling that Jena was hiding something. Cracks in the facade. As the months passed, the tension between Annie and Jena grew. Annie's arrogance often turned into outright hostility. She criticized Jena's cooking, questioned her work ethic, and even accused her of being too slow. One evening, the situation came to a head. Jena had prepared a dinner for Annie and her friends, a lavish spread that included grilled fish, fried plantains, and coconut rice. As the guests ate, Annie loudly criticized the meal. This fish is overcooked, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Honestly, why do we keep her around? The guests exchanged awkward glances, but Annie continued, oblivious to their discomfort. Jena, standing silently in the corner, felt her heart break. She had poured her love into every dish, hoping to connect with Annie in the only way she could. Manda, who had overheard the exchange, intervened. Annie, that's enough, she said sharply. Jena works hard for this family, and she deserves respect. Respect? Annie scoffed. She's just a cook, mother. She should know how to do her job properly. Jena kept her gaze down, but tears pricked at her eyes. She had endured Annie's cruelty for months, but hearing those words stung more than she cared to admit. The truth unravels. Okay, who had been quietly observing the household dynamics, decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. One evening, as he parked the car in the driveway, he approached Jena in the garden where she was watering the plants. Madam Jena? He began cautiously, I need to ask you something. Jena froze, her grip on the watering can tightening. Yes, okay? What is it? I know who you are, he said, his voice low. You're the woman Mr. Dan used to visit in Enugu, aren't you? You're Annie's mother. Jena's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered denying it, but the look in Okay's eyes told her it was pointless. Please, she whispered, tears welling up. Don't say anything. I've only come here to be close to her. I don't want to disrupt her life. Okay hesitated, his expression softening. You've suffered enough, he said. But secrets like this have a way of coming out. Be careful. Jena nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the day of reckoning was approaching, but she wasn't ready for the truth to come to light, not yet. In the days that followed, Jena tried to keep a low profile, but her interactions with Annie grew increasingly strained. The tension reached its breaking point one afternoon when an accident shattered the fragile peace in the household. As Annie stormed into the house after a failed business meeting, Jena accidentally bumped into her, spilling a glass of water on Annie's designer suit. Annie's fury erupted. Are you blind? She shouted, her voice echoing through the house. Do you have any idea how expensive this suit is? It's worth more than your entire life. Jena stood frozen, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak, but her silence only enraged Annie further. Okay, who had been watching from the doorway, finally stepped forward. Annie, stop it, he shouted. You have no right to treat her this way. Annie turned to him, her eyes blazing. How dare you interfere? Okay's voice was firm. Because you don't know who this woman is. She's not just a cook, Annie. She's your mother. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Annie stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. What did you just say? You heard me, Okay said. Jena is your biological mother. The revelation sent shockwaves through the household, leaving everyone reeling. The fragile web of secrets had finally unraveled, and nothing would ever be the same again. The compound was eerily silent after Okay's revelation, his words lingering in the air like an unrelenting echo. Annie's expression was a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and anger. She stared at Jena, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Manda entered the scene, having overheard the commotion from inside the house. She stood at the doorway, her face pale. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice shaky. Okay turned to her, his expression a mix of defiance and guilt. Madam, it's time you know the truth. Jena, she's not just the cook. She's Annie's biological mother. Manda froze, her eyes darting between Jena and Annie. "What nonsense is this?" she spat, though her voice lacked conviction. She turned to Jena, her voice rising. "Is this true?" Jena's eyes brimmed with tears, and her hands trembled as she set down the glass she had been holding. "Yes," she said softly, her voice cracking. "It's true." Annie staggered back as if she'd been struck. "No," she whispered. "This is a lie. It has to be a lie." Jena stepped forward, her face etched with pain. "It's not a lie, Annie. I'm your mother. I gave you up because I had no choice." "You're not my mother," Annie shouted, her voice breaking. "You're just a maid. That's all you are." Manda, still reeling from the revelation, placed a hand on her forehead as if to steady herself. We need proof," she said, her tone desperate. "We'll do a DNA test. Until then, I don't want to hear another word." The DNA test. The next day, the household was tense as blood samples were collected from Jena, Annie, and Manda. No one spoke during the process, but the silence was heavy with unspoken fears and questions. 4 days, the family waited for the results, each grappling with their emotions in solitude. Manda spent hours pacing her bedroom, her mind racing with memories of Dan's confession years ago. She had agreed to raise Annie as her own, but she had never imagined that the biological mother would one day walk into her home. Annie locked herself in her room, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. She alternated between anger and confusion, her mind unable to reconcile the idea that the woman she had mistreated for months might actually be her mother. Jena, meanwhile, remained quiet, spending her days working as if nothing had changed. But her heart ached with every passing moment. She replayed every cruel word Annie had ever spoken to her, the pain magnified by the knowledge that Annie was her own flesh and blood. When the results finally arrived, they confirmed what Jena had said: she was indeed Annie's biological mother. The truth, once hidden, now stood undeniable. Annie's anger. The confirmation sent Annie spiraling. She stormed out of her room, confronting Jena in the kitchen. "How dare you come here and disrupt my life?" she shouted, her eyes red with tears. "You had no right to show up and pretend to be something you're not." Jena turned to face her, her own eyes wet with tears. "I never pretended, Annie. I came here to be close to you, not to take anything from you." "Close to me?" Annie laughed bitterly. "You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool." "I never wanted to hurt you," Jena said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I only wanted to see the daughter I gave up. I've lived with the pain of losing you for 23 years. That's not my problem." Annie screamed, her voice breaking. "You made your choice, and I don't owe you anything." Jena flinched as if struck but said nothing. Annie stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Manda's reflection. That evening, Manda sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of wine. The revelation had shaken her to the core, but as she thought about Jena's pain, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She remembered the nights she had cried over her own inability to conceive and the desperation that had led her to accept Annie into her life. Summoning her courage, Manda knocked on Jena's door later that night. "May I come in?" she asked. Jena nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The two women sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. "I'm sorry," Manda began, her voice soft. "I'm sorry for separating you from Annie for so long. If I had known who you were—" Jena shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. You've been a good mother to her. I see it in the way she carries herself. You gave her the life I couldn't." Manda's eyes filled with tears. "We both loved her in our own ways. But now, we need to figure out how to fix this mess." Annie's guilt. 4 days, Annie remained locked in her room, consumed by guilt. The realization that she had insulted and mistreated her own mother tormented her. She replayed every harsh word, every dismissive glance, and every moment of disdain, the weight of her actions crushing her. "How could I have been so cruel?" she whispered to herself one night, tears streaming down her face. "How can she ever forgive me?" Eventually, Annie emerged from her room, her face swollen from days of crying. She found Jena in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. For a moment, Annie simply watched her, gathering the courage to speak. I need to talk to you, she said hesitantly. Jena turned, her heart skipping a beat. Of course, she said, setting the dough aside. Annie hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Jenna's eyes filled with tears as she stepped forward and pulled Annie into a hug. You don't have to apologize, my child, she whispered. All I've ever wanted is to be close to you. A new beginning. Manda entered the kitchen then, her expression softening as she saw the two women embracing. We're a family, she said quietly. It's time we started acting like one. The days that followed were marked by healing. Jena was relieved of her duties as a cook and given a place of honor in the household. Annie, humbled by the experience, began to treat those around her with more kindness and respect. She apologized to the staff she had wronged and began using her family's wealth to help others. For Jena, being part of Annie's life brought a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Though she and Manda had started as rivals, they found common ground in their love for Annie, forging an unexpected friendship. The truth, once a source of pain, became the foundation for a new beginning. The Umran household, once fractured, was now united by love, forgiveness, and understanding. The transformation of the Umran household was slow but steady. The revelation of Jena's identity had shaken the foundations of their lives, but in the aftermath, the family began to rebuild. What had once been a house divided by secrets and pain was now on a path to healing and unity. Jena's new role. Jena, no longer the quiet cook, now had a place of honor within the family. Manda, acknowledging the sacrifices Jena had made, insisted on her staying in the mansion as a permanent resident. While this decision was met with mixed feelings from the staff, Manda's firm stance made it clear that Jena was part of the family. At first, Jena struggled to adjust to her new role. She had spent years living in the shadows, her only dream being close to Annie. Now that the truth was out, she wasn't sure how to navigate her relationship with her daughter or Manda. You don't have to walk on eggshells, Manda told her one evening as they shared a quiet moment on the balcony. This is your home too now. Jena nodded, grateful for Manda's generosity but still cautious. She knew rebuilding trust and creating a new normal would take time. Annie's growth. For Annie, the revelation of Jena's identity had been a humbling experience. Her arrogance and entitlement, once fueled by her privileged upbringing, began to dissolve. She realized that wealth and status meant little without kindness and empathy. She started by apologizing to the household staff, taking time to thank each one for their hard work. It was a gesture that surprised everyone, especially OK, who had been one of her most vocal critics. You're learning, he said with a small smile as she handed him a handwritten note of appreciation. Your father would be proud. Annie's relationship with Jena, however, was more complicated. While she had apologized and expressed a desire to build a connection, there were moments of awkwardness and discomfort. The woman she had once dismissed as just a cook was now her biological mother, and the shift in their dynamic was not easy to navigate. One afternoon, Annie found Jena sitting in the garden, tending to the flowers. She hesitated before approaching. Do you mind if I join you? Annie asked. Jena looked up, her face softening. Of course not. They sat together in silence for a while, the scent of blooming hibiscus filling the air. Finally, Annie spoke. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't even know how to call you Mom. Jena reached over and gently took Annie's hand. You don't have to force it, she said. We'll figure it out together. Manda and Jena's friendship. Manda and Jena's relationship, once fraught with tension, evolved into an unexpected friendship. They shared a bond forged by their mutual love for Annie and their shared grief over Dan's death. One evening, as they sat in the living room sipping tea, Manda turned to Jena. Do you ever resent me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jena shook her head. No. You gave Annie the life I couldn't. For that, I'll always be grateful. Manda smiled faintly. And you gave her life. For that, I'll always be in your debt. From that moment, their relationship deepened. They began to rely on each other, not as rivals but as allies working toward the same goal, ensuring Annie's happiness and well-being. Annie's new purpose. With her newfound humility, Annie began to see the world differently. She decided to use her family's wealth and influence to make a difference in the lives of others. Inspired by Jena's story and the struggles of the staff who had supported her family for years, she launched a foundation dedicated to empowering underprivileged women and children. The foundation provided scholarships, vocational training, and small business grants. Annie poured her heart into the project, often visiting the communities they served to meet the beneficiaries and hear their stories. One day, during a visit to a rural village in Enugu, Annie stood before a group of women and children, sharing her journey. "I grew up thinking I was better than others because of my family's wealth," she admitted. "But I've learned that true worth comes from how we treat others and what we do to lift them up." Jena, who had accompanied her on the trip, watched from the sidelines with tears in her eyes. For the first time, she saw the woman Annie was becoming, the woman she had always hoped her daughter would be. A united family. Back at the Yumern mansion, the family began to create new traditions. Sunday dinners became a sacred ritual, with Jena preparing meals that reminded everyone of their roots. Manda and Annie helped in the kitchen, laughing and sharing stories as they cooked. On one such evening, as they sat around the dining table, Annie looked at Jena and Manda. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "For loving me even when I didn't deserve it." Jena reached over and placed a hand on Annie's. "You've always deserved love, my child. And you always will." Manda smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We're a family now," she said. "And nothing will change that." The moral of the story. Over time, the Yumern household became a symbol of resilience and transformation. The pain of the past was not forgotten, but it was no longer a source of division. Instead, it became a reminder of the strength that comes from forgiveness and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As Annie's foundation grew, so did her reputation as a compassionate and visionary leader. She ensured that her father's legacy was honored while carving out her own path, one defined by empathy and generosity. Jena, too, found peace in her new role. Surrounded by the family she had longed to be a part of, she finally felt whole. Years later, a family portrait hung in the living room of the Yumern mansion. It showed Manda, Jena, and Annie standing side by side, their faces lit with genuine smiles. The portrait was a testament to their journey, a reminder that even the most fractured relationships can be mended with understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. The household, once a stage for secrets and pain, now thrived as a haven of love and unity. And as the family grew closer with each passing day, they learned that sometimes, the most unexpected bonds are the ones that make us whole. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.